She has no name, not in any ancient text, not in any temple inscription, not on any stone carved by someone who loved her, but she is still standing. Right now, at this very moment, on the western shore of the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth, 1,300 feet below sea level, in a place where nothing living can survive, there is a pillar of salt, roughly human height, roughly human shape, facing south toward where a city used to be. According to 4,000 years of unbroken tradition, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim alike, that pillar is her. She was a mother, a wife, a woman who built a real life from absolutely nothing in one of the most powerful, most sophisticated cities in the ancient Near East. She had a house with gates, daughters she adored, a position in her community that took years of hard work to earn. She survived the most catastrophic single destruction event in the history of the ancient world. Modern scientists have now confirmed what 4 millennia of scripture described. Something came from the sky, something that turned stone to glass and vaporized everything in its path in less time than it takes to draw a breath. She made it out, and then she looked back. One glance, one moment, one final act of love, or grief, or rage, or longing for everything she was leaving behind. And that one look cost her everything. The world calls her Lot's wife. The Bible never gives her a name. Her husband gets 17 chapters. She gets 1 sentence. But here's what I've come to believe after spending months with this story. She is the most honest character in the whole account. And she is the one who tells the truth about what it actually costs to leave something you built, even when that something is destroying you. This is her story, the real one, the one archaeology confirms, the one geology explains, the one that holds up a mirror not to ancient sinners, but to every woman who has ever stayed too long in a life that stopped serving her. Because walking away meant losing everything she worked for. Stay with me, because the last 20 minutes of this video contain the part of this story that no one ever tells, and it's the part that will stay with you long after this is over. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Or to understand this story, really understand it, not just the Sunday school summary, you have to travel back 4,000 years to a world that was, in many ways, more recognizable than you might expect. The year is approximately 1900 BCE, give or take a century. We are in what historians call the Middle Bronze Age, and the ancient Near East at this moment in history is not a collection of primitive tribes stumbling through the desert. It is a networked, sophisticated, deeply interconnected civilization. Egypt is already 2,000 years old. The pyramids at Giza have been standing for 700 years by the time this story takes place. Think about that for a moment. To the people of Abraham's era, the Great Pyramid was as ancient as Jesus is to us. Babylon is a rising power in Mesopotamia. Outer Ur, the city Abraham's family came from, is a major metropolis with a population of 65,000 people, a sewer system, a legal code, and schools that teach mathematics. Ur has a postal service 4,000 years ago. This is not the primitive world of myth. This is the ancient equivalent of the modern world, with international trade, complex financial instruments, specialized labor, written contracts, and diplomatic correspondence that traveled thousands of miles by courier. And right at the center of the most active trade corridor in this world, the land bridge between Mesopotamia and Egypt, the road that every merchant, every army, every caravan had to travel, sat a narrow stretch of territory the ancients called Canaan. And at the southern end of Canaan, in a deep geological trench fed by the Jordan River, sat the cities of the plain. But before we get to those cities, before we understand what Lot's wife was walking away from, we need to understand the man who brought her family to this place. We need to understand Abraham. Abraham, or Abram, as he was originally named, was born in Ur. He was part of a successful, established family. His father, Terah, was a man of means. They had property, livestock, servants, social standing. They had everything that the world of 2000 BCE defined as success. And then one day Abraham heard a voice, and the voice told him to leave. "Leave your country," the voice said. "Leave your kindred. Leave your father's house. Go to a land I will show you. No map. No guarantee, no timeline, just go." And here is the extraordinary thing. He went. At 75 years old, Abraham loaded everything he owned onto donkeys and camels and walked out of the most sophisticated city in the ancient world into the unknown. His wife Sarah came with him. His nephew Lot came with him. Hundreds of servants and livestock came with him. They traveled northwest then south, through Haran into Canaan, through the highlands, through the Negev desert, down into Egypt during a famine, and back again. Abraham's story before Sodom is already a saga of thousands of miles covered on foot across some of the most demanding terrain on earth. But here is what I want you to understand about Abraham, because it's the key to understanding everything that comes later. Abraham builds altars, not temples, not shrines with priests and ritual, just rough piles of stone in open fields, at Shechem, at Bethel, and at Hebron. Every significant place he passes through, he stops and builds a simple altar and calls on the name of the Lord. No ceiling between him and the sky, no intermediary, just a man, a few stones, and a conversation with heaven. There is a kind of person who needs a tent, not because they can't afford walls, but because walls are the thing that eventually starts to own you. Abraham is that kind of person. He has wealth, influence, hundreds of dependents counting on him, and he lives in a tent. His nephew Lot is different. Lot is not a villain. That's important to understand. He is not cruel, not corrupt, not seeking anything that any reasonable person in his time would not seek. He is a practical man, an optimistic man, a man who looks at the world and thinks, with the right positioning, I can make something of this. He is also a man who, when offered a choice between the highlands and the valley, looks down into the green and the prosperity and the possibility and chooses it without a second thought. And he brings his wife with him. She doesn't get a voice in the text at this moment. She never gets much of a voice. But she was there, on that ridge at Bethel, when her husband looked down at the Jordan Valley and made his calculation. She was there when he chose the direction of their future. She packed up whatever a woman packed up in 1900 BCE and followed her husband toward a city that was about to change both of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Here is where the story gets scientifically extraordinary. And I want you to pay attention to this section carefully. Because everything that happens later depends on understanding the geography. The Jordan Valley is not a normal valley. It is part of one of the most geologically violent features on the surface of the earth. The Great Rift Valley is a crack in the earth's crust that runs 6,000 miles. From the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, down through Israel and Jordan, through the Red Sea, through Ethiopia and Kenya, all the way to Mozambique. It is one of the places where the tectonic plates of the earth are actively pulling apart. And the Dead Sea sits right at the bottom of the deepest part of that rift. The surface of the Dead Sea is currently the lowest point on dry land on Earth, 1,370 feet below sea level. The lakebed itself descends another 1,000 feet below that. Now, 4,000 years ago, yes, this valley looked dramatically different than it does today. The Dead Sea was larger. The Jordan River was more robust. The southern basin, what is now a shallow industrial evaporation flat, was a living lake. And the land around that southern basin was, in the words of the book of Genesis, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. That description is not romantic exaggeration. Geological and pollen analysis from sediment cores drilled in the Dead Sea Basin show that around 2000 BCE, the southern Jordan Valley had a subtropical microclimate, date palms growing 40 feet tall, 2 harvest cycles per year, an annual rainfall significantly higher than today. The Jordan River deposited rich alluvial soil across the plain. Natural springs fed the lowlands. And beneath it all, and this is the part that made these cities rich, there were vast deposits of bitumen. Bitumen, asphalt, tar, what the Bible calls slime or pitch. It is natural petroleum, crude oil in its thickest, most viscous form, that seeped to the surface through fractures in the limestone bedrock around the Dead Sea. And in the Bronze Age world, bitumen was as strategically important as oil is today. It was the waterproofing agent that made large wooden ships seaworthy. Without bitumen, the great trading fleets of the ancient Mediterranean couldn't have existed. It was the mortar that the Babylonians used to build their ziggurats. Egyptian embalmers used it in the mummification process. That's where the word mummy actually comes from. The Arabic word for bitumen is mumya. It was used as an adhesive, as a sealant for grain storage, as a binding agent in construction, as a primitive caulk. It was used in medicine. It was used in waterproofing pottery. The Dead Sea Basin produced bitumen in quantities that no other accessible location in the ancient Near East could match. Large chunks of it, some weighing hundreds of pounds, would float up from the lakebed and wash ashore. The ancients called it floating stone. Sodom and Gomorrah and the 3 other cities of the plain controlled this supply. They sat at the intersection of the bitumen fields and the major north-south trade route connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt, and they charged accordingly. This was not a backwater. This was a critical node in the supply chain of the ancient world, but the same geology that made the Jordan Valley rich also made it dangerous. And the Dead Sea Rift is seismically active, has been throughout recorded history. Large earthquakes in this region occur on a geological timescale that's relatively short. Significant events happen every few centuries. There are records of earthquakes changing the course of the Jordan River, of entire sections of hillside collapsing into the valley, of water levels in the Dead Sea dropping dramatically after seismic events. The bitumen deposits themselves were a risk factor. Porous limestone saturated with petroleum, pressurized by geological forces near an active fault system. Under the right or wrong conditions, that's an incendiary subsurface. The people who lived there knew the earth was restless. The old shepherds in the hills watched the animals, tracked the tremors, read the signs. But in the cities, behind 20-foot walls and with merchants arriving from 3 continents and silver filling their counting houses, it was easy to feel untouchable. Progress has always had a way of making people feel immune to consequence. And there's one more geological detail that will become crucial when we get to the night of the destruction. The Dead Sea is one of the saltiest bodies of water on Earth, currently about 10 times saltier than the ocean. Its surface is thick with dissolved minerals: sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, potassium chloride. In certain atmospheric conditions, especially during high-temperature events, those mineral particles can become airborne. The air near the Dead Sea, during a catastrophic thermal event, would have been supersaturated with salt. Keep that in mind. Well, because when we come to the moment when Lot's wife turns around, when we talk about what actually physically happened to her, that salt in the air is the key to everything. The ridge at Bethel. 2 men stand on the highland looking down at the world. One of them is old, weathered, patient. The other is younger, ambitious, capable. Between them stretches the Jordan Valley, a ribbon of impossible green cutting through the dry landscape like a wound that had healed into something beautiful. Abraham the patriarch gives his nephew first choice. Is not the whole land before you? If you take the left, I'll take the right. If you take the right, I'll take the left. It's the offer of a man who has learned something that most of us don't learn until we're much older. And some of us never learn at all. That grasping for the best thing is often how you end up with the worst thing. That the most valuable real estate isn't always the one with the most water. Lot lifts his eyes. The text says he looked up, an active, intentional survey of the landscape. He's not glancing. He's assessing. He's calculating. And he sees water. He sees grass that stays green even in the dry season. He sees date palms along the river. He sees city walls in the distance, the comfort of civilization, the security of numbers, the promise of markets and trade and opportunity. The Jordan Plain was, according to Genesis, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Both comparisons are significant. Eden in Egypt, paradise and prosperity, the best of the spiritual and the material worlds, apparently combined in a single valley. And Lot chose it. There's nothing wrong with that choice on its face. Any rational man looking at the same landscape would have made the same calculation. You take the water, you take the fertility, you take the strategic advantage. That's not greed, that's good sense. But here is the phrase the text uses that I want to draw your attention to. He pitched his tent as far as Sodom. Not in Sodom, not at Sodom. As far as Sodom, the phrase carries directional movement. He's not arriving, he's pointing. The tent faces the city. The tent is oriented toward the city. The family goes to sleep each night facing the direction of Sodom. And that directional lean, that gentle, barely noticeable tilt toward the thing you've decided you want, is how every life-altering compromise begins. Not with a dramatic decision, not with a conscious choice to abandon your values, just with the tent facing the wrong direction. Watch what happens next, because it happens in stages, and each stage feels perfectly reasonable. First, the tent is pointed toward Sodom. Lot and his family are still outside the city. They're travelers, pastoralists, people who define themselves as separate from the urban world. Then the flocks need water, and the best water is near the city, so they move closer. Then one of Lot's daughters makes a friend in the city, and the girls want to spend time together, so the family spends more time near the gates. Then a merchant in the city has a business proposition, and the arrangement requires Lot to be available quickly, reliably, so a tent outside the walls is inconvenient. Now, a room inside the city makes more sense. Then the room becomes a house, and the house gets a gate, and Lot the nomad, the nephew of Abraham, the man who walked out of Ur with nothing but faith and a herd of cattle, is now a property owner in Sodom with a mailing address and a seat at the city gate. 5 steps, each one logical, each one justifiable, each one slightly further from where he started. This is not a story about a weak man. Lot is not portrayed as stupid or wicked. He's portrayed as someone who made reasonable choices in a reasonable sequence, each of which made perfect sense in the moment and led him somewhere he never intended to go. Which is, if you think about it, a far more frightening story than a tale of simple villainy. Villains are easy to avoid. You recognize them. You walk the other way. The slow, sensible. Want incremental walk into the cage? That's the one that gets you. The text says almost nothing about her during this period. She doesn't get a name. She doesn't get lines. She doesn't get an opinion recorded. But she's there. She's always there, in the negative space of the narrative. She was there when the tent faced Sodom. She was there when they moved closer to the walls. She was there when the house was built, when the daughters were born, when the daughters grew up, when the daughters were given in marriage to men of the city. She is the one, in all likelihood, who negotiated the prices in the market. She is the one who developed friendships with neighboring women. She is the one who learned the social customs and figured out which festivals to attend and how to dress and what gifts were appropriate for which occasions. Tenor, she is the one who made Sodom home, because that is what women do. They arrive in a strange place and they build a life in it. They learn the neighbors' names. They figure out which merchants are honest and which ones cheat on their weights. They maintain the relationships that hold a family inside a community. By the time the angels arrived, she hadn't just moved into Sodom. She had woven herself and her family into its fabric. Her daughters' futures were in that city. Her friendships were in that city. The infrastructure of her entire daily existence was in that city. When they told her to leave, they weren't asking her to abandon a place. They were asking her to abandon herself. I want to pause here and say something that may be a little uncomfortable. We tend to tell this story as if Lot's wife was wrong to look back, as if her action was a simple failure of obedience, a lesson for children about following instructions. But consider what she was leaving. Her daughter's husbands, the sons-in-law who laughed at Lot's warnings, were still in that city. They hadn't come. She was running away from her children's spouses, from people her daughters loved, her home, the physical structure she had maintained for years, the rooms where her daughters grew up, the doorpost she had crossed 10,000 times, was in that city. Every friend she had made since arriving in the valley, every relationship, every familiar face at the market, every woman who had shared a meal with her or helped her through a hard season, all of it burning. I am not saying she was right to look back. The angel gave a clear instruction. But I am saying her impulse to look back was one of the most human things in this entire story. And I think the Bible preserves it not to condemn her, but to tell the truth about what leaving actually costs. Leaving is not free. Walking away from the thing that has become your identity, even when that thing is harming you, even when God himself is telling you to run, costs something real. It costs something that doesn't have a simple name, and she paid the full price. Close your eyes for a moment. No, actually don't close them. But imagine with me. You are walking through the main market of Sodom on a morning in the early summer. The sun has been up for 2 hours. The air is still relatively cool. It will get brutally hot by midday, but right now there's a breeze coming off the Jordan River. It's carrying the smell of river water and wild tamarisk and morning bread, baking in 100 clay ovens. The market is already packed. Sodom is a 24-hour city in the way that any major trade hub is. There are always merchants arriving, always transactions to complete, always someone who needs something and someone else who has it. To your left, a Phoenician merchant is unrolling bolts of purple-dyed linen on a wooden table. Purple dye in this era is made from a species of murex sea snail, and it takes 10,000 snails to produce a single gram of the dye. A length of purple fabric costs more than a laborer earns in a year. He has 12 bolts. Someone in Sodom can afford them all. To your right, a woman from the highlands is selling ceramic jars. They're beautiful, hand-thrown. She painted with geometric patterns in red and black. She looks uncomfortable. Her eyes keep moving. She is new here, and she hasn't yet learned the rules. Ahead of you, a scale tips in a transaction between two men. Silver is weighed. Numbers are spoken in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, the English of the Bronze Age world. A contract is sealed. The smells layer on top of each other. Cumin and coriander from a spice merchant, the rich fat smell of roasted lamb, the astringent scent of a tanner's booth, and beneath all of it, persistent and unmistakable, the black petroleum smell of bitumen. It clings to everything in this city. The streets are paved with it. The walls are caulked with it. It is the invisible foundation of every transaction in this marketplace. This is a city that works. The archaeological evidence from Tal el Hammam and from other Bronze Age sites in the southern Jordan Valley shows a level of urban sophistication that consistently surprises researchers. Walls 20 feet thick and up to 30 feet tall, requiring a workforce of tens of thousands to construct. Multi-story mud brick buildings, a water management system involving cisterns and channels, evidence of long-distance trade in obsidian from Anatolia, copper from the Sinai, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Afghanistan. Someone in this valley in 1900 BCE had a trading relationship that reached Afghanistan. And now you understand why Lot stayed and why his wife built a life here. Because this was real prosperity, real civilization, real opportunity, not a mirage. Now I need to address something. Most people, when they hear Sodom, I think they know what the city was destroyed for. They learned about it in church or from cultural osmosis, and they have a simple answer. But the actual biblical description of Sodom's sin is far more complex and far more relevant to modern life than that simple answer. In the book of Ezekiel, written several centuries after the events we're discussing, the prophet defines the iniquity of Sodom directly. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, failure to help the vulnerable. That is not a description of a fringe criminal class. That is a description of a cultural posture, a civic ethic, a collective value system that had inverted itself, that had taken prosperity and turned it into contempt, that had taken comfort and turned it into cruelty. Sodom wasn't destroyed because of its worst people. It was destroyed because of its culture. Because what was done in that city to strangers, to the poor, to the unprotected, was not the exception. It was the rule. It was how things worked. The process is gradual. It always is. In the early days of a prosperous city, the prosperity feels like a gift. People are grateful. They share. There's a communal generosity that comes from the memory of having had less. Then the prosperity continues, and the memory of having had less fades. And the prosperity starts to feel like something that was earned, deserved. And if I earned it and deserved it, and you don't have it, how then perhaps you didn't earn it? Perhaps you don't deserve it. And once that logic takes root, once a culture decides that wealth is a measure of worth, everything downstream from that changes. The stranger becomes a threat or a mark, not a guest. The poor person becomes a problem or a resource, not a neighbor. Exploitation stops feeling like cruelty and starts feeling like the natural order of things. Sodom had a specific institution that embodied this. When travelers arrived in the city, there was a practice, recorded in several ancient sources, designed to discourage the poor from overstaying their welcome. Beds were provided to travelers, but the beds were a fixed size. If a traveler was too tall, they were trimmed to fit. If they were too short, they were stretched. It's a story that sounds like a dark fairy tale, but it functions as a cultural metaphor. This city reshapes outsiders to fit its own needs, and anyone who doesn't fit gets cut down. And Lot sat at the gate day after day, watching how strangers were treated, and said nothing, because by this point, his voice, his conscience, had been so long subordinated to the maintenance of his position that it barely registered as a whisper anymore. She saw it too. She had to. Women in the ancient Near East occupied a specific social position that gave them a particular vantage point. They saw the texture of daily life in ways that men who were focused on commerce and politics often didn't. They were the ones talking to the servants. They were the ones at the wells and the ovens and the fabric merchants. They saw how the city treated its most vulnerable people from ground level. She knew what happened to travelers who arrived without protection. She knew which households in the neighborhood were cruel and which were merely indifferent. She had lived among these people long enough to read them clearly, and she had also, in all likelihood, been shaped by them. Not into cruelty, the text doesn't suggest she was a cruel woman, but into silence, into the particular kind of moral accommodation that long-term exposure to a compromised system produces. You stop being shocked. You start explaining. You start using the language of the culture to describe behaviors that would have horrified you 10 years ago. You call it tradition. You call it culture. You call it just the way things are done here. This is not weakness. This is human. This is what happens to anyone, whether male, female, ancient, or modern, who lives long enough inside a system that normalizes the abnormal. And then one evening, as the sun turned the limestone walls of Sodom to hammered gold, two strangers walked in through the city gate, and everything changed. I want to take a break from the narrative for a few minutes, because what archaeologists and earth scientists have found in the Jordan Valley in recent decades is genuinely remarkable. And it makes the story you're hearing far more than just a religious account. The site, Tal el-Hammam, that's the technical name. It's a large Bronze Age tell, an archaeological mound created by the accumulated debris of centuries of habitation, located on the northeastern shore of the Dead Sea at the southern end of the Jordan Valley. It was first excavated in 2006 by a team led by Stephen Collins of Trinity Southwest University. What they found was immediately striking: a very large Bronze Age city, heavily fortified, with evidence of significant wealth and long-distance trade, occupying what would have been an extraordinarily strategic position in the ancient trade network. The city had been destroyed, completely, violently, instantaneously destroyed. And above the destruction layer, nothing. No pottery, no architecture, no evidence of human habitation for approximately 700 years. Something had happened here that didn't just end the city, it ended the region. In September 2021, a team of researchers published a landmark paper in the peer-reviewed journal Scientific Reports. The team included archaeologists, geologists, geochemists, mineralogists, and impact scientists, 21 researchers from 6 countries. The paper was titled, "A Cosmic Airburst Destroyed Tal el-Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age City in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea." The title tells you everything about what they found. Let me walk you through the evidence they cataloged, because it is extraordinary. First, the pottery. Across the destruction layer, the researchers found ceramics that had been subjected to extreme temperature events. Not heated by a fire, melted. The surface layers of pottery sherds had been vitrified, turned to glass, at temperatures exceeding 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. For reference, a normal Bronze Age burning event, a fire, a city torched by an army, reaches temperatures of perhaps 1,500 degrees. The temperatures at Tal el-Hammam were nearly twice that. Second, the mud bricks. Mud bricks throughout the site had been fired from the outside in. If a city is burned from within, by invaders, by accident, the heat comes from inside the buildings. The bricks would be fired from the inside out. But at Tal el-Hammam, the heat came from above and outside. The bricks were cooked on their exterior faces, indicating a massive thermal event from above. Third, shocked quartz. This is a specific form of quartz that can only form under extreme pressure, pressures of millions of pounds per square inch. Shocked quartz is found at nuclear test sites and meteor impact craters. It was found across the destruction layer at Tal el-Hammam. Fourth, platinum and iridium anomalies. These elements are rare in Earth's crust, but present in elevated concentrations in extraterrestrial material. Meteors, asteroids, comets. The Tal el-Hammam destruction layer shows elevated platinum and iridium levels consistent with a cosmic impactor event. This is the same chemical signature found at the Chicxulub impact site, the crater from the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs. Fifth, trinitite-like glass. Trinitite is the glass created at the Trinity nuclear test site in New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb was detonated. The desert sand was melted and fused into a layer of green glass. Similar glass was found at Tal el-Hammam. Not identical, the chemistry differs, but formed by an analogous process. Extreme instantaneous heat fusing sand into glass. Sixth, tiny spherules of iron and silica. These microscopic balls are formed when materials are vaporized and then rapidly cooled, a process that can only happen in extreme heat events. Seventh, sulfur. Pure sulfur, brimstone, scattered across the site in concentrations far above background levels. The researchers found it in small spherical pellets, formed under high-temperature, high-pressure conditions. The conclusion the researchers reached: a meteoric airburst event, a space rock, they estimate perhaps 50 to 100 meters in diameter, entered Earth's atmosphere, was heated by friction to extreme temperatures, and exploded approximately 2.5 miles above the Jordan Valley. The explosion was equivalent to perhaps 15 to 20 megatons of TNT, roughly 1,000 times the force of the Hiroshima bomb. The thermal pulse alone would have been sufficient to kill every person within a radius of several miles instantaneously. The shockwave would have demolished every structure in the valley. The secondary fires from the igniting bitumen deposits would have burned for days. The researchers also found elevated sodium levels in the soil of the destruction layer, salt driven deep into the earth by the blast. The Dead Sea, already hypersailing, would have had its surface layer volatilized by the thermal event, sending a salt-loaded atmospheric wave across the valley. This is why nothing grew in that region for 700 years. The earth was salted, not metaphorically, literally chemically salted. The Bible says God rained down burning sulfur on the cities of the plain. It says Abraham looked south and saw smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. It says the entire plane was overthrown. The scientists say cosmic airburst, 15 megatons, 1650 BCE, destruction horizon 700 years deep. These are not contradictory accounts. They are the same event described from two different vocabularies, separated by 4,000 years. Miles to the north earlier that same day, three men had appeared without warning at the tent of Abraham in the oak grove at Mamre. It was the heat of the day, that dead hour after noon when even the insects fall silent and the air shimmers with the weight of the sun. Abraham was sitting in the shade of his tent door, an old man in his 90s, his beard white as salt, his eyes still clear. He looked up and saw them. Just there, standing in the shimmer of the heat. Three figures in the road. He didn't ask who they were. He ran to them. He bowed himself to the ground. My lords, please, don't pass by without stopping. Let me bring water. Let me bring food. Rest under the tree, and then you can continue on your way. This is the ancient law of hospitality, the code of the desert. A stranger at your tent door is not an inconvenience. He is a sacred obligation. You give your best, not your second best, not the leftovers. Your best, without being asked, without expectation of anything in return. Because in a world without hotels, without public infrastructure, without safety nets of any kind, hospitality was survival. The man you shelter today may save your life tomorrow. And even if he doesn't, the stranger is always also a test. Abraham commanded his household like a general. Water for the feet, bread, a calf, tender and good, prepared at once. Sarah baked bread from their finest flour with her own hands. Abraham stood by while they ate, serving them himself in the shade of the ancient oaks. And then one of the visitors, the one whose voice carried something that made the leaves stop moving, spoke a promise so outrageous it drew laughter from behind the tent wall. I will return about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Sarah was 90 years old. She was, in the clinical language of modern medicine, far past any possibility of conception. And she laughed, the dry, bitter, exhausted laughter of a woman whose body had betrayed her dreams for decades. The laughter of someone who has stopped hoping for the impossible. Why did Sarah laugh? And Sarah, suddenly terrified, said, I did not laugh. And the voice came back, quiet and absolute. No, but you did laugh. The curtain of the ordinary had torn, and what looked through the tear was something that knew things humans have no right to know. Something that heard a suppressed laugh in a closed tent from 15 feet away. Something that had come with purposes larger than a meal. The three rose to leave, and two of them turned their faces toward Sodom. Abraham walked with them to the ridge overlooking the valley. And here the narrative slows. The visitor, who had spoken the promise of Isaac, pauses, and the text records, almost as an interior monologue, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is very grave. I am going to go down and see. And Abraham understood. His nephew was in that city. Lot's wife was in that city. His grandnieces, young women he had watched grow up, were in that city. And a destruction was coming. Abraham did something that no human being had done before in the recorded text, and that only a handful have done since. He began to argue with God, not from arrogance, not from disrespect, from love and from a deep conviction about justice that he believed God shared. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, to treat them all the same. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? If there are 50 righteous people in the city, will you spare it for their sake? For 50 righteous, yes. I will spare the whole place, Abraham pressed, his voice growing quieter, more desperate with each exchange. 45? 40? 30? 20? Each time, yes. For the sake of that many, I will not destroy it. And then the final number. The number that tells you everything Abraham knew about the city where his family had chosen to live. What if there are 10? For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. 10. Abraham bargained all the way down to 10. Not 10 perfect people. Not 10 spiritual champions. 10 people with a functioning conscience. 10 people who would say no when the crowd said yes. 10 people who would protect a stranger when everyone else wanted to harm him. And the fact that Abraham stopped at 10 rather than pressing further, the fact that he didn't bargain down to 5 or 3 or 1, tells you what Abraham knew about Sodom. He didn't think there were 10. He hoped there were 10. But in his heart, In the deepest part of the wisdom of a man who had traveled the world and read people clearly for nearly a century, he feared there weren't. The Lord departed, and Abraham stood alone on the ridge in the cooling afternoon air, watching two figures walk south toward the valley. He had done everything he could, which is to say, not enough. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon when the two angels walked through the gates of Sodom. They looked like men, ordinary men, if unusually fine-featured. They carried the dust of the road on their robes and the long stride of men who had covered serious distance. Nothing about them announced what they were. Lot was sitting at the gate, his usual place, his position of authority, the seat that signified he was somebody in this city. He saw them come in, and something happened in him. Some long-dormant instinct fired. Some part of him that hadn't spoken clearly in years suddenly screamed. He rose. He bowed himself with his face to the earth, the gesture of maximum deference, the same gesture Abraham had made. And then he spoke with an urgency that his carefully cultivated civic composure could not entirely contain. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house. Spend the night. Wash your feet. Rise early and go on your way." They declined. "We will spend the night in the town square." And Lot pressed them strongly. He didn't explain why. He couldn't explain why. Not in the open gate of a city where the wrong word overheard could cost him everything. But his insistence said everything. "Do not stay in the square. Come to my house. Trust me on this." They came. Inside, behind closed doors, Lot made them a feast. Unleavened bread. The bread of haste, the bread baked when there isn't time to let it rise. The same bread that would later become the sacred food of Passover, the night of deliverance. Food prepared with urgency, with shaking hands, with the knowledge that time was short. His wife cooked it, quietly, efficiently, watching her husband's face with the practiced attention of a woman who had learned to read his moods over decades. She had never seen him look like this. The daughters sat in the corner, watching, uncertain. They could hear the city outside, the normal sounds of evening, the distant music, the laughter, the sound of commerce continuing. Nothing unusual, nothing to explain their father's terror. And then the sound changed. It started as a murmur. The way rumors move in a city, quickly, silently, person to person, through the gossip networks that operate beneath the surface of every urban community. On two strangers at Lot's house, young, handsome, unprotected, no family here, no powerful patron, no one to call if something happened. The murmur became movement, and the movement became a crowd. The text is specific and terrible. All the men of the city, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. All of them. The merchants who dealt in silver, the craftsmen who built beautiful things, the fathers who blessed their children at night prayers, the men who had sat beside Lot at the gate and helped him adjudicate disputes. All of them, in the torchlight, pressing against his walls, unified in a single terrible appetite. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so we can know them." No, the Hebrew word yada. In its most intimate sense, this was not curiosity. This was the final expression of a culture that had spent decades turning the outsider into prey. This was what Sodom actually was, stripped of its purple linen and its silver scales and its architectural magnificence. This was what you got when you removed the daylight and the social convention in the presence of eyes that might judge. And Lot, compromised, comfortable, cowardly, genuine, flawed, human Lot, stepped outside alone and closed the door behind him. He faced the city, his city, the city where he had raised his daughters and built his fortune and earned his seat at the gate. He stood between the mob and the people under his roof, and he called them brothers. Brothers. Even now, even here. Please don't do this wicked thing. And then, and this is the part that is hardest to sit with, he offered them his daughters instead. "I have two daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you. Do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Inside the house, his wife heard every word. She didn't say anything. The text gives her nothing here. But she heard her husband trade her daughters to a mob in order to protect strangers. She heard the price he was willing to pay. She heard who was valuable and who was expendable in the calculus of Lot's honor. The crowd didn't accept the offer, not because they had principles, but because the offer itself was an insult. "This fellow comes to stay among us as a foreigner, and now he's acting as our judge. We'll deal worse with you than with them." Yet they surged forward, pressing Lot back against his own door. And then the door opened behind him. Hands, stone-strong hands, hands that did not feel entirely human, reached out and pulled Lot inside. The door slammed. and through the windows a light blazed. Not torchlight, not firelight. Something white and total and absolutely steady, something that didn't flicker. The crowd screamed, not in rage, in pain, in terror, clutching at their eyes, falling over each other, weeping in the street. The angels had struck them blind, but they didn't leave. Even blind, even on their hands and knees in the street outside Lot's house, they kept crawling toward the door, kept feeling for the latch, kept trying to get in. And that detail of the blind mob still crawling toward the house, tells you more about the spiritual condition of Sodom than any other single fact in the narrative. This was a city that would not stop, even when stopped, even when struck down, even when its own destruction was literally in progress. Some appetites only end when everything ends. Inside the house, the angels were no longer gentle. Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law? Sons? Daughters? Bring them. Bring everyone you have in this city. We are going to destroy this place. The outcry against the people here has become so great that the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Destroy, not judge, not reform, not warn and wait. Destroy. Lot ran through streets where blind men still wept and cursed and crawled, in past houses where lights burned in ordinary evening domesticity, people who had no idea yet what was coming. Past the temple whose priests were asleep, whose gods were ornamental, whose altars had no power over what was about to fall from the sky. He found the houses of the men who had married his daughters, the sons-in-law. He pounded on the doors. Get up, get out, get your wives and get out of this city. The Lord is going to destroy it. They came to their doors blinking, half asleep, annoyed. It was past midnight. Their father-in-law was wild-eyed, panting, his hair disordered, smelling of fear. He was telling them a supernatural story about strange men and a mob struck blind and the imminent destruction of their entire civilization. They laughed. He seemed to them to be jesting. That phrase, he seemed to them to be jesting. It is one of the most heartbreaking lines in the entire account. Not because the sons-in-law were evil men, but because they were comfortable men. Men whose comfort had become so total, so complete, so thoroughly insulating that they literally could not process the reality of judgment. The concept didn't compute. You know what they were thinking. They were thinking if God were really going to destroy this city, there would be signs. There would be warnings. The priest would say something. The authorities would act. Things this big don't just happen without warning, without process, without time to respond. They were wrong, and they died in their beds. Lot returned home as the first gray light was touching the eastern horizon. 3 a.m, the hour when the body is at its lowest, when fear is most physical, when courage is least available. The angels were urgent now. Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here. Leave now, or you will be swept away when the city is punished. And Lot lingered. The text says it with almost clinical brevity. He lingered. He stood in his beautiful house with the cedar table from Lebanon and the Egyptian linen and the silver cups and the small idols his daughters kept in their rooms, and he couldn't move. His wife was also frozen. She stood in the room they had shared for years, looking at the objects that told the story of her life in this place, the jewelry she wore to the temple festivals, the cooking vessels she had used 10,000 times, the bed where her daughters had slept when they were small. This is not a simple failure of faith. This is the phenomenon that modern psychologists call the endowment effect, the documented tendency of human beings to overvalue what they already possess relative to what they might gain. It's why people stay in unhealthy jobs, unhealthy relationships, unhealthy situations far longer than an outside observer would think rational. The loss of what you have feels larger than the gain of what you might get, even when what you have is a city about to be incinerated. The things in that house were not just objects, they were evidence. Evidence that the life she had built was real. Evidence that the sacrifice and the compromise and the silence had been worth it. Evidence that she existed, mattered, had made something of herself in the world. Walking away from them wasn't just inconvenient, it was existentially threatening. It meant admitting that the foundation on which she had built her identity was not in fact solid. And so she stood there, and Lot stood there, and the sky outside was beginning to do things skies should not do. The angels did not wait. They seized him by the hand. They seized his wife by the hand. They seized his daughters by the hands. The text says, the Lord being merciful to him, merciful. I'm being dragged out of your house by celestial beings at 3 a.m. while your city prepares to be annihilated is, apparently, what mercy sometimes looks like. Not soft words, not patient waiting, not a gentle suggestion revisited at a more convenient time. The mercy was seizing them physically and pulling them out of the burning house when they had lost the capacity to exit on their own. Sometimes the most loving thing that can be done for a person is to override their hesitation, to take their hand and pull. Because the house is on fire and they're standing in it looking at the furniture. They were set down at the edge of the city, and the angels gave their final command: escape for your life. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills lest you be swept away. The hills, back to the highland. One, back to the rough country where Abraham still lived in his tent. Back to simplicity, to poverty relative to what they had. Back to the beginning. And Lot, even now, even at the edge of the apocalypse, with the sky behind him beginning to glow wrong, negotiated. Oh, please no, my lords. You have been so kind to your servant. You have shown me such great kindness in saving my life. But I can't escape to the hills. The disaster will overtake me, and I'll die. Look, there is a small city nearby. Let me flee there. It is very small, isn't it? And my life will be saved. The city was Zoar, one of the 5 cities of the plain, the smallest one, the one least complicit, perhaps, in the culture of exploitation, or perhaps just far enough away from the epicenter. Lot couldn't go all the way back to the highlands. Even salvation had to be negotiated down to the most modest possible version. Even fleeing for his life, he was still trying to stay as close as possible to the world he was leaving. And the angel, perhaps out of genuine mercy, perhaps out of something that functions like divine exhaustion with this particular man's inability to fully commit, agreed. Very well, I will grant you this request too. I will not overthrow the city you mention, but run there quickly because I cannot do anything until you arrive. I cannot do anything until you arrive. The fate of an entire city's destruction being held in suspension, waiting for one wavering man and his family to reach safety. There is something almost unbearably intimate about that detail. The universe waiting, holding its breath, for Lot to take his last few steps to safety. They ran, 4 people on a road in the gray pre-dawn, running away from everything they had ever built. The city behind them still sleeping, the merchants in their beds, the priests in their quarters, Lot's daughters' husbands, the laughing sons-in-law, still warm under their covers, certain that morning would be ordinary. The air was wrong. Anyone who has ever experienced the atmospheric pressure change before a major storm knows that feeling. The thickening, the heaviness, the sense of the air holding something it hasn't released yet. But this was beyond that. This was the atmosphere responding to something entering it from above. The animals sensed it first. The dogs in the city behind them began to howl. Not warning barks, the helpless. An existential howling of creatures whose instincts were screaming at them, and whose walls provided no escape. Birds were everywhere in the sky, disoriented, flying in directions that made no sense. She ran beside her daughters. She could hear her husband's breathing ahead of her. Ragged, strained, the breathing of a man whose comfortable life had robbed him of the fitness he'd had as a young herder. The sky behind them had been wrong since they left the city, but now it was getting wronger. A quality of light that preceded the dawn but was not the dawn. An amber glow where there should have been darkness, as if the sun had gotten confused about which direction it rose from. She knew what was happening. She must have. The angels had not been subtle. The city was being destroyed. Everything behind her was ending. And still she ran. Waits until she didn't. No one knows exactly when she stopped. The daughters didn't see it happen. Lot didn't see it happen. He was ahead of her, focused on his own forward movement, his own survival, his own bargaining with the terms of his escape. One moment she was there, and then she wasn't. And then the sky opened. What made her stop? The text doesn't say. The text just records the result. She looked back. She became a pillar of salt. But human beings don't just stop in the middle of running from their death for no reason. There was a reason. We will never know for certain what it was, but we can imagine. Maybe it was a sound. Maybe the first atmospheric shockwave of the airburst reached her ears. A sound unlike anything she had ever heard. A bass note so deep and so total that her body stopped before her mind had processed what it was. The same way you freeze before you've identified what startled you. Maybe it was the light. Even running away from it, the thermal pulse of a 15-megaton detonation would have lit the ground in front of her, reflecting off the sand, turning the pre-dawn world to noon in a fraction of a second. Maybe she stopped in shock at the sudden brightness and turned to see the source. Maybe it was grief. Maybe the knowledge of what was happening behind her. The daughters-in-law who had stayed, the neighbors she had lived beside for decades, the women from the market whose names she knew, the sound of the city that had been the soundtrack of her adult life, became suddenly, physically unbearable. and she turned not to see but to say goodbye, to witness, one last time, what she was losing. Maybe she turned in rage. Maybe in that moment she felt something about what had been done to her life, the choices made for her, the things she had not been asked about, the daughters offered to a mob, the years of silence, the long, slow erosion of everything she had once been. And the rage turned her around. Maybe it was love, the most complicated, indefensible, absolutely human kind of love. The love that survives even when the beloved is killing you. The love that says, I know this is wrong. I know this is over. I know there is nothing I can do, but I cannot leave without looking one more time at what I loved. All of these possibilities are true to some part of the human experience. All of them are understandable. None of them saved her. What happened to her body was not miraculous in the sense of being outside the laws of physics. It was miraculous in the sense of being a natural process operating at a scale and speed that no human experience could have prepared her for. The thermal pulse from the airburst had superheated the air in the Jordan Valley to temperatures that exceeded anything naturally possible on Earth's surface. That superheated air had interacted with the hypersaline surface of the Dead Sea, volatilizing millions of tons of salt minerals into the atmosphere. The air she breathed when she turned was supersaturated with sodium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, salt particles so dense they were almost a solid medium. Combined with the extreme heat, with the dehydrating effect of the thermal pulse on all moisture in the environment, with the chemistry of mineral crystallization under rapid temperature change, her body became the catalyst for the salt that was already in the air. The moisture in her skin, her eyes, her lungs drew the salt to her. It crystallized on contact, layer over layer, in the fraction of a second between the thermal pulse and the shockwave that followed. She was encased, not painlessly. Nothing about what happened in that valley in those minutes was painless. But quickly, she stands there still, or something very like her stands there still. The geology of the Dead Sea region produces exactly this kind of formation. Human-shaped pillars of layered salt and mineral deposits on the western cliffs, carved by wind and water and time into shapes that generations of travelers have recognized. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, said he saw it with his own eyes. The rabbinical tradition says it is still there, eroding and renewing and eroding again with the salt-laden weather of the Dead Sea Basin. And the tradition says her name, the name no text records, is Irit, a Hebrew name meaning asphodel, a pale flower that grows in barren places. A flower associated in ancient mythology with the afterlife, with the border between the world of the living and the world of the dead. A flower that grows only where nothing else can. Perhaps that's right. Perhaps her name was Irit. Perhaps someone remembered. Perhaps someone, somewhere in the chain of oral tradition that carried this story across 4,000 years, preserved the name that the official text forgot to write down. Or perhaps we gave her a name later. Because we couldn't bear for her to be nameless. Because the story was too important, and she was too central to it, to let her remain simply Lot's wife. She deserved a name. She still does. The sun was rising. Over the eastern hills, the first light was breaking, that clear, golden, extraordinary light of dawn in the Jordan Valley. The light that turns limestone walls to hammered gold and makes even a desert look like a garden. In Sodom, bakers were lighting their ovens. Guards were changing shifts at the gates. Merchants were beginning the slow process of setting up their stalls for another day of commerce. The blind men from the night before were being tended by physicians who had no explanation for what had happened to them. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. It was going to be a beautiful day. And then something appeared in the upper atmosphere. It would have been visible first as a streak, the kind of thing people sometimes call a shooting star, except longer, slower, thicker, leaving a persistent glowing trail behind it. A fireball, moving from the northeast, dropping through the atmosphere at hypersonic speed, surrounded by a plasma sheath that burned at temperatures exceeding those at the surface of the sun. Someone in Sodom saw it. Perhaps many people saw it. And for the fraction of a second they had to see it before the light hit them, they must have understood that whatever this was, it was unlike anything that had ever happened before. And then the thermal pulse arrived. Light travels faster than anything. The pulse of radiant heat, pure energy, moving at the speed of light, hit the valley before the sound, washed before the shockwave, before any physical debris. It arrived in the fraction of a second between seeing the fireball and having time to form a response. Exposed surfaces reached temperatures of thousands of degrees in milliseconds. The limestone walls of Sodom, the walls that had stood for centuries 20 feet thick, testimony to human ambition and engineering capability, began to melt. Not crack, not crumble. Melt. Like wax held too close to a flame. The people of Sodom didn't have time to pray, didn't have time to run, didn't have time to call out to their children or their gods or the merchants they owed money to. The thermal pulse ended their ability to form thoughts before it ended anything else. 60,000 people, the researchers estimate, in the southern Jordan Valley on that morning. Oh, all of them gone between one heartbeat and the next. The thermal pulse was only the beginning. Milliseconds behind the light came the shockwave, a wall of compressed air moving faster than the speed of sound, carrying with it the overpressure of a 15-megaton explosion, the kind of pressure that has a number in the scientific literature, but no analogy in human experience. The walls that hadn't melted were demolished, flattened, not collapsed. The distinction matters. Collapse implies a structure giving way under gravity. Flat means the structure was simply pushed into the earth by force too great to resist. Everything above ground level became a projectile. Every stone, every timber, every storage jar, every beam, moving at speeds that made them weapons. And then the fire from below, the bitumen deposits. The vast subterranean reserves of petroleum that had made Sodom wealthy. The slime pits, the seeps, the pressurized petroleum locked in the limestone bedrock of the Jordan Valley. The thermal event had superheated the surface layers. The shock wave had fractured the bedrock, and the bitumen ignited. Fire erupted from the earth itself. Geysers of burning petroleum shooting from the ground, the deep sulfurous smell of ancient petroleum igniting. Brimstone, the ancient word, sulfur released from deep geological formations under extreme heat and pressure. Fire rained from above. Fire erupted from below. The cities were caught in a vice: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim. 4 of the 5 cities of the Confederation erased in a morning. Only Zoar, the smallest, the most distant from the epicenter, the city Lot had negotiated for, with the city the angel had agreed to spare for the sake of one wavering man who couldn't quite believe he deserved to survive. Only Zoar stood. Miles away on the ridge at Hebron, Abraham had been awake since before dawn. He rose early. The text is specific about that. He rose early and went to the place where he had stood the day before and bargained with God, the place where he had pressed all the way down to 10 righteous people and received his answer. He looked south, toward the valley where his nephew lived, and he saw the smoke, a column of it, black and gray and red at the base, rising from the entire southern end of the Jordan Valley like smoke from a furnace. Those are the exact words Genesis uses, like the smoke of a furnace. The smoke from a 15-megaton airburst, and it combined with the burning petroleum fields and the collapsed urban structures still combusting, would have risen to an altitude of miles and been visible for 300 miles in every direction. Abraham stood there, the old man, the man of faith, the man who had bargained for mercy and been told, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." There had not been 10, there had been 4, Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters, and of those 4, one was already dead. And the garden that his nephew had chosen over the highlands, the valley that had looked like Eden, that had promised everything, was now ash and salt and silence. The text says Abraham looked and he saw. It doesn't say he prayed. It doesn't say he spoke. Sometimes there is nothing to say. Sometimes you just stand on the ridge and look at the smoke rising from your family's choices, and you grieve and you remember, and you go back to your tent, and the tent is still standing, because it was never built on anything that could burn. Lot made it to Zoar. He fell through the gates as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, gasping, weeping, his daughters on either side of him. 3 people where there should have been 5. His wife was behind him on the road, a pillar of salt facing south. His sons-in-law were in the ruins of the city. His house, the fine house with the cedar table and the silver cups and the gate that had meant he was somebody, was ash. He was alive, and that was all he was. He didn't stay in Zoar long. The text says he was afraid to stay there, afraid of what might come next, afraid that the destruction was not finished, afraid that proximity to the Jordan Plain still meant proximity to judgment. So he went to the mountains, the very mountains the angels had told him to flee to in the first place. The rough highland country he had refused, had negotiated against, had declared himself too weak to reach. He went there anyway. In the end, after surviving on his own terms and finding that his own terms were not sufficient, he went to the mountains. And he lived in a cave, a man who had owned a house with gates now sheltered in a hole in the rock. A man who had sat in judgment at the city gate now had no city. A man whose wealth and position and identity had all been tied to a place that no longer existed had, in the most literal possible sense, nothing. Nothing except two daughters. When we need to talk about them, because their story, which is uncomfortable and strange and often glossed over, is actually the most honest part of the entire aftermath. The two daughters of Lot had grown up in Sodom. They had been educated in its values, shaped by its rhythms, formed by its culture. They had been given in marriage to local men. They had expected to spend their lives in the city their father had made his home. Instead, they were sitting in a cave in the mountains with their traumatized father, surrounded by nothing, watching the smoke of the world they had known rising from the valley below. Their mother was dead. Their husbands were dead. Every friend they had ever made was dead. Every future they had imagined was gone. And in the profound isolation of that cave, watching the psychological aftermath of the most catastrophic event they had ever experienced, they convinced themselves of something that was not true but must have felt absolutely true in the disorientation of extreme trauma. They believed they were the last people on earth. "There is not a man on earth to come into us in the way of all the earth," the older daughter said to the younger. "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children." They weren't the last people on earth. Abraham was within walking distance on the ridge above Hebron. The city of Zor was just miles away. The world had not ended. But trauma does that. Extreme trauma shrinks the world to the immediate, the visible, the felt. It makes the present catastrophe feel like the total catastrophe. It makes the ruins you can see feel like the ruins of everything. What the daughters did next is described plainly in the text, without editorial comment. They made their father drunk on 2 consecutive nights, and they became pregnant by him, and they bore sons who became the fathers of 2 nations, Moab and Ammon, who would be thorns in the side of Israel for generations. The text doesn't condemn the daughters. It doesn't praise them. It just records what happened and leaves the weight of it for the reader to carry. But here is what I think the account is doing when it tells this story. It is being honest about the fact that surviving the fire doesn't mean walking away clean. Lot survived. His daughters survived. They were the righteous ones, or righteous enough, to be pulled out while 60,000 others perished. Why, they had the hand of mercy literally laid on them, physically pulling them to safety. And they still carried Sodom inside them. The city burned. But the values it had instilled, the transactional view of human relationships, the willingness to use people as means to survival ends, the loss of the categories of what is acceptable and what is not, those didn't burn. They survived, and they expressed themselves in the cave. This is not a story about how God saved the good family from the bad city and everyone lived happily ever after. This is a story about how corruption operates at a deeper level than geography, about how the things a culture teaches us don't disappear when the culture does, about how long the shadow of Sodom actually was. The last we see of Lot in the biblical text is in that cave, drunk, not unaware of what was happening. A man whose entire life had been a series of choices made for immediate comfort, immediate safety, immediate advantage, and who ended in a cave in the mountains, having lost everything he chose. His wealth was gone. His city was gone. His sons-in-law were gone. His wife was salt. His daughters were pregnant by him, and he didn't know it. The man who pitched his tent towards Sodom ended with nothing. And this is the hardest part of this entire account to sit with, because Lot is not a monster. He is never portrayed as a monster. Peter in the New Testament calls him righteous Lot. Righteous, despite everything. He is a man who was vexed by the wickedness around him, who tried to protect strangers, who attempted to warn his family, who ran when told to run. He did almost everything almost right. Almost. And he just couldn't quite fully leave. He couldn't quite stop looking at what he was losing. He couldn't quite resist negotiating for the smaller compromise. He couldn't quite get all the way to the mountains when that was where safety lay. And almost right in the story of Sodom is not enough. This isn't cruelty. This is consequence. There is a point in every moral decline where the next step is the last one, where the direction you've been traveling arrives at its inevitable destination, where the tent you pitched towards Sodom has finally become the cave you're living in. Lot never understood, perhaps, that the journey he made, from highland nomad to city official to cave dweller, was the same journey, one continuous movement in one continuous direction all the way to the end. And his wife, the woman with no name, or perhaps the name Irit, understood it in the only way available to her, by looking back, which is, when you think about it, the only honest response to what they were leaving. Let me speak to you directly now, not to the general audience of a YouTube channel, to you specifically. You are, if you're a typical viewer of this channel, a woman somewhere in the middle of her life. You've built things. You know what it takes to build things. The years of showing up, the compromises, the relationships maintained through effort and intention, the sacrifices that nobody saw and nobody credited. You are not naive. You have been on this earth long enough to have learned some of its hardest lessons. You know what it's like when something you trusted turns out to be less than it appeared. You know what it's like to be in a situation that worked once and has stopped working, but that you're still in because leaving it would mean dismantling something real that you built with real effort. You know, probably the specific exhaustion of loving something that is not good for you. I'm talking about the story of Sodom, but I am talking about your life. The golden cage is real, and I want to be clear about something. It is not built by villains. It is not constructed of obviously bad things. It is built out of your best work, your hardest choices, your most loyal relationships, the things you stayed through when most people would have left. It is built out of everything you're most proud of, and that is precisely what makes it a cage. Mani, because when the angel shows up, when the voice that cares about your survival says it's time to leave, you can't just walk out. Not when everything you are is inside those walls. Not when leaving means admitting that the building was being constructed in the wrong place, on the wrong foundation, oriented in the wrong direction. Lot's wife didn't look back out of weakness. She looked back out of love, the specific, devastating love of a woman who had given decades of her life to a place and a people, and a version of herself, and couldn't release that love even when the love had become the thing that killed her. How many of us know that love? How many of us are still carrying it? The tent pitched towards Sodom. I've been thinking about that image since I first read this story carefully. The tent isn't in Sodom yet. Pottery, the tent is just pointed that way, oriented, leaning. What is your tent pointed toward right now? Not where are you going? Not what are you doing? What are you building toward? Not what relationships are you in? Which ones are you leaning into? Because here is what the story of Lot teaches us. The destination is usually not a sudden decision. It's the cumulative result of 100 small orientations, 1,000 small leanings, a gradual drift that feels in each individual moment like reasonable pragmatism. The first step towards Sodom feels like opportunity. The second step feels like settling in. The third step feels like belonging. The fourth step feels like this is just who I am now. And by the fifth step, the tent is long forgotten and you have a house with a gate and you don't quite remember when you stopped being someone who slept under stars. The correction is not dramatic. The correction is just turn the tent, not a crisis, not a catastrophe, not burning everything down and starting over. Just turn the tent. Reorient the direction of your daily choices toward the thing that is actually good for you, one small decision at a time. The angels didn't ask Lot and his wife to destroy what they had built. They asked them to leave it and move forward, to let it be what it was, real, valuable, genuinely theirs, and to let it go. That is the hardest instruction ever given, and almost nobody wants to follow it until the sky's on fire. I want to say one more thing about her, about the woman with no name, or perhaps the name Erit, was Jesus in the New Testament says simply, remember Lot's wife. That's the entire instruction. 3 words, the shortest sermon in the Gospels. Remember her, not condemn her, not don't be like her, not learn from her mistake. Just remember her. There is an act of compassion in that, a recognition that she is not primarily a cautionary tale. She is a person whose end is tragic not because she was bad, but because she was profoundly, recognizably, heartbreakingly human. She loved something that couldn't save her. She held on past the point of safety. She turned toward what she was losing instead of away from it, which is something that every person who has ever loved anything understands. Remember her because she is us in our worst moments. Remember her because the pull she felt, the gravity of the invested past, the weight of what we've built, the ache of what we're leaving, is a pull that every human being feels when they try to walk away from something that has become their identity. Remember her so that when your moment comes, when the angel takes your hand and the fire is already behind you and the voice says, do not look back. You remember that looking back is possible, that the pull is real, that the temptation will feel like love, and you choose forward anyway. On the western shore of the Dead Sea, in the salt cliffs of Mount Sodom, yes, there is still a mountain called Sodom, there is a pillar of salt approximately 40 feet tall that geologists have named Lot's wife. It erodes and reforms, erodes and reforms. The salt dissolves in winter rains and new layers deposit from the evaporating summer air. It is always changing. Shuri, it is always approximately the same shape. It is always there. And if you go there, and you can go there, it's a tourist site now. There's a road and a viewing platform. And you stand in front of it as the sun sets over the Judean hills, and the Dead Sea turns copper, and the air carries the faint mineral smell that has never entirely left this valley in 4,000 years. You are standing in front of a person who was loved enough to be saved, and who couldn't quite believe that what was ahead of her was worth more than what was behind her, who couldn't quite trust the forward direction, who gave one last look to the city she had loved and the life she had built and the version of herself she was leaving behind. The smoke has long since cleared from the Jordan Valley. The ruins are dust. The silver is buried and the purple linen is gone, and the bitumen fields are depleted and the 20-foot walls are gravel under your feet. But she's still there, 40 feet tall, facing south, still looking at what she lost. May we all have the courage she couldn't find, and may we remember her name. This has been the real story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and of the woman who stood in the road and looked back. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life and your own choices, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, what is one thing from this story that you're going to carry with you? We read every single comment, and your words matter to this community.